In a previous video, I spent some time talking about the first of the two major crises that occurred during the time of Isaiah. And today we're going to focus very specifically upon chapters 36 through 39, which provide for us the second of the major crises during this time. So the major events that we see in Isaiah's lifetime occur in, for instance, I'll just quick timeline, in 740 with the death of Uzziah. This was a national upheaval, quite devastating for the nation. We also saw during Isaiah's time Assyria began its real strong emphasis as an international empire. Isaiah also saw the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722, 721. And during his time, he began to see also the emergence of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Though it was still largely under Assyrian domination, we see the seeds of it really beginning to creep in, that then as it moves into the 7th century, we see clearly that the Babylonians are going to rise, the Assyrians are going to decline, so that when Judah actually does fall, it is not the Assyrians who bring that about, but in fact it is the Babylonians that do. The two military crises, and sometimes I refer to this as the geopolitical crises that were faced during this time. The first is under Ahaz, and this was the subject of the previous video, where Israel and Aram sought to force Judah into compliance and literally marched against it. These events are discussed again in that earlier video. It is related to us from Isaiah 7 through 9 in the book of Isaiah and elsewhere in the historical narratives. The second event is really going to be the focus for us today. This is under Hezekiah. Hezekiah's time is roughly 715 to 686. Now, Hezekiah actually preceded that time of 715 in a co-regency with his father Ahaz, but we'll come back and talk about that in a moment. This crisis under Hezekiah is primarily the Assyrian crisis of 701. And these events are going to fit within the time frame of Isaiah 36 through 39, as well as in 2 Kings 18 through 20. Now, there are multiple layers of history that are applicable to this particular event. For instance, you have the layer of the Assyrians, the movement from Shalmaneser to Sargon and to Sennacherib, and then on the Judean side with Judah, you have the layers of what's going on with Hezekiah, the potential death that he could experience roughly 702, 701, 23, somewhere along in there. We're not sure exactly when that was, but the extension by 15 years, which then allows him to experience a continuation of his work. So there's a lot to be discussed in these chapters, and I just want to walk us through this very sequentially. And we're going to look at the primary text. And there are two major areas where we find the primary text. The first is in Isaiah 36 through 39. Note, this is in narrative form. It's very interesting that in this prophetic book you do have scattered occasionally some sense of narrative, and here is a prime example of that. The other primary text that we'll look at in a few moments is 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20. But we're going to look at Isaiah first, and I think that's very appropriate, and then we'll put that in comparison to what we see in 2 Kings, which is virtually word for word the same. Chapter 36, and if you look at the titles of your study Bibles, or you just get a real quick glimpse at those chapters, you'll see that there are certain things that occur in 36, 37, and 38, and 39, those four chapters. In chapter 36, we have the introduction of Sennacherib and the invasion of Judah. Sennacherib has conquered Lachish, 40-something cities, by one account 46 cities. And from Lachish, which is a nearby fortified city in Judah, Sennacherib sends his royal spokesperson to Jerusalem to demand submission. He tells them not to expect deliverance. In other words, the envoy is speaking to those who are on the walls who are listening. Specifically, Eliakim is the primary individual that we're referring to, and he's telling them, you cannot expect deliverance by the hand of Hezekiah the king, nor by their God Yahweh. He offers to them threats that they will be conquered and they will be deported. Interestingly, the king has already indicated to the Israelite men who he had sent out to hear from the envoy that they are to remain silent. They are not to speak a word. And as a result, that will give Hezekiah and the prophet, and then certainly the Lord, the ability to act and to accomplish what is accordance with God's purposes. That's chapter 36, where all this takes place. Then we come to chapter 37. This is where Hezekiah sends to Isaiah for prophetic counsel. Good on his part. One of the neat things about Hezekiah, in spite of some of his failures, he was uniquely gifted for this particular time. So he sent to Isaiah for prophetic counsel. And Isaiah told them, don't fear what you've heard, because in a short period of time the Lord will put a spirit in him. He will hear a rumor and return to his own land, or I will cause him to fall by the sword. That's chapter 37, verse 7, reading from the Christian Standard Bible. And what Isaiah is saying is that the Lord is going to handle this, and you need not fear Sennacherib. You need not fear this army that you see even around you, as we'll find from 2 Kings. The envoy brought a significant army with him. So Sennacherib left Lachish to fight at Libnah, but Sennacherib sent a letter to Hezekiah indicating that his reticence to respond would be dealt with. Now we'll also learn from 2 Kings 18 that Hezekiah, this is one of his failures, he did try to placate Sennacherib by sending gold and silver, but it was not sufficient. Sennacherib would not have enough to do with it, wouldn't have anything to do with it. It was not enough. Subsequently, as he receives this letter now, Hezekiah begins to pray to the Lord. And Isaiah sends the Lord's response to Hezekiah, which is in the form of a judgment against Sennacherib, verses 21 through 35, indicating that Sennacherib would not be able to assault Jerusalem. Though the army may be surrounding Jerusalem, the army would not be able to assault it. And this would be as the Lord's commanding in verses 33 through 35. And I just want to go ahead and give this to you because it's really significant. This is the actual text, Christian Standard Version from Isaiah. Therefore, this is what the Lord says about the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city. He will not shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with a shield or build up a siege ramp against it. He will go back the way he came, and he will not enter this city. This is the Lord's declaration. I will defend this city and rescue it for my sake and for the sake of my servant David, indicating the lineage of David as the king. That's exactly what we're going to see happening in chapter 37, verses 36 through 38, which follow after, of course, this judgment pronouncement. Text tells us, then the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. Now, we're not told specifically whether these were the Assyrians who were at Jerusalem or the ones that were at Lachish or the ones that had been sent on to Libnah. It really doesn't matter, because when the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and left. He returned home and he lived in Nineveh. And then the last verse tells us this. One day, while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword and escaped to the land of Ararat. Then his son Esarhaddon became king in his place. So the Lord accomplished exactly what was spoken through the prophet to the king. So this is Isaiah chapter 37. Now we move to chapter 38, and I think in terms of chronology, it is more likely that we need to place chapter 38 previous to chapter 37, and you'll see why in just a moment. There's nothing wrong about doing that. The reporting of the events here are not just giving us they're giving us the story, but they're not necessarily giving us the chronology. Note in particular, as I've kind of laid this out for us here, that it is likely this was before Sennacherib's attack, because verse 6 mentions that God would deliver Hezekiah from the Assyrian assault. Now, the text in chapter 38 indicates that he was terminally ill. I like the way the Christian Standard Bible chooses to translate this. But Isaiah has now come to him to say that he's not going to recover. Hezekiah petitioned the Lord with tears. Isaiah receives a new word from the Lord for Hezekiah, that now the Lord has heard his cry. And in part, as we'll see in 2 Kings, because Hezekiah has been a good and faithful servant, that in fact the Lord is going to provide 15 more years to Hezekiah's life. And to prove that this is going to be the case, and we don't know what the dire terminal illness potentially would have been, but the Lord apparently felt it was important and significant to provide some type of affirmation that what he spoke was going to take place. And so he did, in fact, do that. And the sign was that the sun's shadow on the stairway would go back 10 steps to show that the sun, in essence, reversed, which would have been a miraculous thing. The text reveals that, in fact, this did happen as prescribed. And the remainder of the chapter 38 is the poem that is composed by Hezekiah. There's a little short addition at the end of that chapter that we won't worry about addressing, but the primary portion of the last part of that chapter is the poem that Hezekiah has now written. We come to the last of the chapters in Isaiah. This is 39. Hezekiah exercises very, very poor judgment. Sometimes this is described as Hezekiah's folly, and he is called to account for it. But his poor judgment kind of follows in this way. There are Babylonian envoys who show up, and they are sent by Merodach-Baladan, who was a Babylonian king. He was intermittently in power, a thorn, as I say on the slide, in the side of Assyria's kings. He had apparently heard that Hezekiah had been ill, and in all likelihood may have also heard that he had been revived or been granted additional life. And we don't know all that he actually heard, but just a little bit of, interpolation there. And so he sent his envoys, he sent a letter, and he sent gifts to Hezekiah on hearing about this sickness and recovery. Now, there is probably some political intrigue going on here. I don't know that this is just the well wishes of one king to another, especially because of the gifts. In all likelihood, as Merodach-Baladan is still trying to be a usurper, as a Babylonian usurper against the Assyrians, he's probably trying to form and build alliances, and that's in all likelihood what's taking place here. Regardless, Hezekiah was flattered, and then foolishly proceeded to show the envoys all of his treasure. The text is quite clear about this, whether it's in Isaiah or whether it's in 2 Kings. Subsequently, Isaiah confronts him about this foolish display and chides him and prophesies that, in fact, one day in the future, that the Babylonians will be the very ones who will plunder the very treasures that he has so foolishly displayed. Now, that is exactly what we see happening with the fall of the southern kingdom. The Babylonians, who, remember at this point, Assyria is at their, almost at a zenith. They're at a high point. Their empire is spreading, though they're constantly putting down with conflicts in different parts of the nation. They've got Egypt down to the south. They've got the Babylonians with Merodach-Baladan that's occasionally popping his head up. It's kind of like whack-a-mole, and they're always dealing with that. But Assyria is very, very strong. But what the prophecy provides, and what chapters 40 and following are also going to bring comfort to and restoration about and a future hope for, is that in fact there will come a day when Judah will fall. And this is one of those little inserts here that is significant related to the future outcome of the nation. And Hezekiah, he says, okay, I got it. I see it. But the text conveys something of his internal thought process, that he basically said to himself, hey, it's not going to happen during my lifetime, so I'm not going to worry about it. So he was thankful that at least it wouldn't happen when he had to deal with it. That's a little bit of a selfish way to view it, but that's exactly the internal snapshot that we're shown here by the narrator. Now we move to the second of the primary text, and I know it says number 1 up there too, but that's supposed to be a number 2. This is the second, 2 Kings 18 through 20, and I'll change that when I pop this up to the website for you to download. This is 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20. So chapter 18 kind of puts us right into the assault on Jerusalem by Sennacherib. These are things that you've already heard about. But it gets us into the context of this by telling us a little bit more about Hezekiah. That in fact Hezekiah has become king. He's at the age of 25, and he begins this wonderful spiritual reformation process. There's this revival of sorts that's taking place. Somewhat reminds us of what's going to happen with Josiah a little bit later. But he is reorienting the people to a spiritual alliance and allegiance. Allegiance is the better word, to Yahweh. And the text indicates that there's not one of the kings of Judah that was like him. Either before him or after him, the Lord was with him, and wherever he went, he prospered. There's just a very blatant acknowledgement that Hezekiah was one of the great kings of the southern kingdom, probably, at least here, even acknowledged as the greatest of those kings. There's a little bit of a interruption here, but it's important because it sets the context for what's about to happen. Verses 9 through 12 review the fall of the northern kingdom to Shalmaneser. But what we see happening is that Shalmaneser is followed by Sargon, who is followed by Sennacherib. So there's a thread of continuity here from the historical perspective of the Assyrians that leads us from the fall of the northern kingdom, from Shalmaneser to Sargon. In fact, Sargon actually at times takes credit for the fall of the northern kingdom, but it was actually Shalmaneser who effected it. Shalmaneser immediately died, and Sargon then took over, and he took credit for it. And so Sargon is going to be a major player here in these intervening years, but in fact, Sargon is going to meet his end in 706 with the Cimmerians. So then we have, after Sargon, we have Sennacherib, and that's what we see with the assault on Jerusalem by the Assyrians that we have here. These are the details that chapter 18 provides for us concerning the assault. Sennacherib, and I have a little bit more information about this process when I come to the end of the presentation here. I'll actually give you a timeline in the history of how this plays out. But jumping ahead a little bit, Sennacherib attacked and conquered the fortified cities such as Lachish and others, potentially up to 46 of them. Hezekiah, according to 2 Kings 18, sends this initial tribute of all the silver and even the gold on the doors of the sanctuary to Sennacherib at Lachish. That's in verses 14 through 16. But this is not sufficient for Sennacherib. His ire is up. He's really hot. He's mad. He's not going to just accept this and say that's good enough. So he then sent his envoy with this massive army, and this is where the text tells us that not only did the envoy himself go, but a massive component of the army went with him. And they were positioned around Jerusalem, and certainly at certain parts. And the text gives us at the aqueduct of the upper pool. There's an interesting development here from a historical perspective that this aqueduct system, the upper pool, there's a reason why they were probably there, because water and the ability to sustain oneself with water was critical to withstanding a siege, or if you were the conquering army, cutting off the water was critical to enacting a siege. But that's where the position is placed there, and I'll talk a little bit more about this important tunnel called Hezekiah's Tunnel when we come to the timeline. Verses 19 through 36, and this is really, really significant. I love this about the Bible. In 2 Kings 18 through 20, as well as then in Isaiah 36 through 39, you have significant portions that are virtually word for word, the same material. There are occasionally some word differences. There are times when a phrase is left out in one and not included in the other, or more explanatory material is given in one as compared to the other. But it's clear, and you will see at the end of this, that this all comes from official records. It is clear that there was a sanctioned historical process of recording, recording, and keeping records that was in place. So 19 through 36 detail almost word for word the same material as Isaiah. And here, as in Isaiah, the envoy gives the Assyrian demands. The men of Judah remain silent, and the story continues on. Chapter 19, just as we've seen before, Hezekiah sends to Isaiah for counsel, virtually word for word, 19 and Isaiah 37, with only an occasional slight difference. There's no substantive differences both in the text as well as in the substance and material, the content. The Lord, in fact, then delivers Jerusalem just as he has said. The same story that we find from Isaiah. Moving from chapter 19 into chapter 20, and here we go again, one more time, where you have the replication of the story of the illness of Hezekiah, virtually word for word the same, with slight exceptions. And here are some of the exceptions. I've listed a few things here. For instance, the option for the shadow's direction to move backwards or forwards is given to Hezekiah, whereas in Isaiah, it's just specified or stated that this is the way it was going to actually take place. The manner of healing is explained. In essence, he was to go up to the temple. There was the applying of an ointment. And so the method or the manner of healing is more explanatory here in 2 Kings. In this case, in fact, the poem of Hezekiah is not recounted in 2 Kings 20, whereas we find that in the book of Isaiah. And then chapter 20 also includes Hezekiah's foolish display. This is recounted in this chapter as well, including the prophetic word of Judah's future fall and calamity. So these two texts, they parallel each other exactly. There's the themes are the same, the substantive content is the same. The text is virtually word for word with maybe an explanatory phrase over here or something left out over here. But it's clear that this is exactly the same events and incident, the same, probably even the same textual basis that may have come, in fact, from the records of the kings, as you will read in the latter part of that chapter. So what I want to do now is kind of take all of that and put it into something of a tentative timeline related to Isaiah and the events of Hezekiah. And I think it's important to be able to look at this both chronologically, historically, to see how it fits. And I think sometimes it helps us kind of sort it out in our minds when we're trying to figure out really the flow of history from the biblical text, the narratives, because there are times when they're not necessarily set up for us in chronology. One text right after the other, giving us an exact chronological timetable. So here it is. Here's the timetable. Isaiah began his prophetic ministry approximately 740. And remember, this coincides with the death of Uzziah, as detailed in chapter 6. And I think that's right on target. Chapters 1 through 5 are, I believe, something like a preamble that sets us up for the call that happens in chapter 6. So then the chronology actually starts, and the things that are portrayed for us in chapters 1 through 5 are from other different parts of Isaiah's ministry, but are included early in the book in a kind of a rhetorical device or a narrative device to provide for us the rationale for the call. So Isaiah begins the prophetic ministry in 740. Uzziah dies. Remember that not long after this, from 740 down to 722, 721, we have the fall of the northern kingdom. And this is with the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, technically Shalmaneser V, who was succeeded by his son Sargon II. And the northern king at this time was Hoshea, And at this time, the southern king was Ahaz, who ruled from 735 to 715. And remember, those last few years with Ahaz were co-regencies with Ahaz and with his son Hezekiah. So Hezekiah and Ahaz co-reigned for a number of years, beginning in approximately 729. He was 11, Hezekiah was 11 at the time, and during that co-regency, he himself also saw the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom. In 715, Hezekiah began his formal regency. In other words, this is when he really could exert the kind of influence that he would want to, and because of the things that he had seen, and let's affirm that in all likelihood because of what he saw happen with the northern kingdom, and the text tells us when you look at 2 Kings that it was because of the things that they had done. Hezekiah was probably fully aware of how they had fallen, what maybe instigated their fallenness in terms of their rebellion against the Lord and their then susceptibility to the invasion of the Assyrians. And so he began a number of religious reforms, and as I indicated earlier, was credited as being one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of all the kings of Judah. It is also during Hezekiah's tenure that, especially this probably occurred 715 and onward, not long after he actually had full regency himself, there were some attempts made to reunite the northern remnant with the southern nation under the unification of the one worship, the one united worship of Yahweh. 2 Chronicles 30 gives us the account of the celebration of the Passover, and the northern tribes were invited to this. In fact, the letter was sent out, the invitation was given. It tells us in 2 Chronicles that the inhabitants basically scoffed at this invitation. I find it interesting that it uses the word inhabitants, because my thought might be that we're not referring necessarily to the remnant Israel at that point. The inhabitants may be the others who were deported from foreign countries into the northern kingdom. Therefore, they would not have necessarily had a spiritual basis of the worship of Yahweh to respond appropriately to this invitation. Let's just kind of walk through this and see what could be possible then. The text does seem to indicate from 2 Chronicles that there are peoples from those tribes, the 10 tribes, the northern tribes, still in place. That though you had those imported, there were those still in place because, in fact, some of those peoples did attend. It does appear that it was not a widespread participation. There are some overtones in the text that give us that thought. But again, I'm wondering if it really has more to do with the fact that the persons deported from foreign countries into the Samaria area were the ones who pretty much said no, and the ones who were still the remnant of the northern tribes of Israel may have been the ones more inclined to participate. I think also, and I've got this listed on the slide, it's also likely that after the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom, that there were a number of persons from the 10 tribes who now would have been considered as somewhat of refugees, who migrated from the north into the south and virtually then began to assimilate into the nation of Judah. I think that's very possible because when we come back to the time after the exile, now you have the accounting of the tribal ancestral list so that they can understand who is and who isn't a part of Judah or an Israelite or a Hebrew person. I think it's very likely then that there was still the retention of a tribal identity of these persons from the northern kingdom who made their way, migrated into the southern kingdom, perhaps even a remnant then still left in the northern kingdom who might have participated in some of the revival or the reforms that Hezekiah put in place. Please understand that it's very speculative. I don't have a lot of external basis to make those judgments, but there does seem to be some internal textual cues that highlight that at least as a possibility. The timeline continues. So now we have the Assyrian king Sargon, who after Shalmaneser V, Sargon II here, is consolidating his empire, and he's occasionally dealing with the uprisings in Babylon, and this is the Merodach Baladan that's going to pop up time and time again. Assyria, in fact, lost control over Babylon for approximately 12 years, and there were also skirmishes on the western front. You'll see the king of Tyre, who has kind of a prominent place in a few moments. Judah, of course, falls into this category, as well as other surrounding nations. It seems likely and probable that Hezekiah, in view of the spiritual reforms that he took place, and I'm relying upon Kaiser and Wegner to identify this potential trend, that with Assyria's attention elsewhere, these spiritual reforms taking place there in Judah, there was a slow, subtle, but perhaps identifiable distancing of Judah from Assyria. In other words, there's an attempt, subtle again, to establish some measure of independence instead of being a vassal, having a vassalship. The end result of this, however, is that Sargon, who was a constant threat, portrayed such strength that in all likely Hezekiah made a quick, hopefully satisfactory tribute to somehow alleviate that possibility that Sargon would turn his wrath upon them. Kaiser and Wegner point to this as a possible movement earlier that eventually, of course, leads to what we do see with Sennacherib, who is Sargon's son, making his way into the west. So Sargon was still dealing with the Babylonian revolt and then did begin to turn to the north, and this is where the Cimmerians, he began battling with them, and in fact, I believe it's 607, actually lost his life in the battles with them. Which then, of course, moves us to Sennacherib, and Sennacherib is the key player that we see in the texts that are primarily under consideration for us today. This is the gentleman in the king in Isaiah and in 2 Kings. He dealt initially with Merodach Baladan of Babylon, in fact took Babylon. Merodach's going to show up again. You'll see that in Isaiah 39 and in 2 Kings 20, where he sends an envoy to Hezekiah, and that's where the foolish incident occurs. So Sennacherib, now having taken over from Sargon, is trying to settle all these matters in the different parts of his empire, and he is now purposed to move against the west, the coastlands, and this of course includes Tyre, the coastlands north of modern-day Israel, the Phoenician coastlands, etc., and also Judah. And Judah is our operative nation here. So in this case, Hezekiah, who has had what seems to be a loose alliance with Tyre and with others, recognizing that their day was probably going to come, that there was probably no way to avoid some type of military confrontation with Sennacherib, they began the process of preparing. And there were already in place, and perhaps even more fortified at this time, a system of cities, fortified cities across Judah. There were, according to Sennacherib and others, there was a count of 40 plus, potentially up to 46, maybe 50 or so. I'm not sure that I have an exact number on that. Lachish, of course, is the one that's going to play a role in Sennacherib's assault upon Jerusalem. We find from archaeology, and there's some really fascinating stuff that you can Google and you can look it up. Look up King Hezekiah, look up the walls, the broad wall. Maybe you can just type in specifically the broad wall of Hezekiah. But apparently there in Jerusalem, Hezekiah began significantly fortifying or refortifying, perhaps building new walls. And these have been excavated. Some of them have been excavated and revealed. And the broad wall, of course, is one of the most significant that has been discovered. But probably the most significant of all the things that Hezekiah did is the tunnel that is then so named after Hezekiah. And I've devoted a whole slide to this because it is probably one of the most famous parts about Jerusalem today, apart from, of course, the Temple Mount. And this was built at the commission of Hezekiah during these intervening years, probably, let's just say, between 705 to 701. And we don't know a lot about exactly how long it took, and I'll address that in a moment. But somewhere in that time, knowing that there was the significant potentiality for an assault by Sennacherib, Hezekiah began doing this, and one of the works was the tunnel. So the tunnel, it's deep, of course, in the ground, but it ran approximately 1,750 feet from an external fortress area that was still at or on or inside barely one of the outer walls, 1,750 feet from the Gihon Springs to the Siloam Pool. Now, the Siloam Pool is well known to us who read the Bible or have heard Bible stories, so we know this name. But the Siloam Pool may have been this additional aqueduct that was utilized and developed during this time to ensure that there would be plentiful water. The Gihon Spring head already had a fortified area, but apparently, and I think appropriately, was noted as needing additional security to ensure an army couldn't access it, or specifically to cut it off. You wanted to be able to make sure that both of those were in place. Estimates on the construction go anywhere from as little as 9 months up to 4 years. And I'm going to also attach to the place where I put the PowerPoint slide presentation, I'm going to attach 2 videos from YouTube that will walk you through or show you a little bit about the Hezekiah's tunnel, the Siloam tunnel, the Gihon Spring tunnel. It is incredibly fascinating. I have seen the portion of the Siloam Pool. I've not myself had the privilege of actually walking through the tunnel, but that is certainly one of the things at some point I would very much like to do. There was an inscription found in 1880 that describes something of the process of building, and apparently there were 2 teams of men who began work on opposite ends and began making their way toward the middle. Now, if you see in the videos that I'll recommend to you, you'll see that the course that they went was not necessarily a straight line. They were moving in a general direction, but it was more of a snaky, curvy kind of process. However, they did meet in the middle and apparently were only a few feet apart. And the story goes that they were able to hear, maybe through a little crack, a little crevasse area, they could hear the voices of their compatriots on the other side, and therefore they were able to, just within those few feet, able to actually join the tunnel. It's a magnificent work of ancient productivity. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it, to have gone 1,750 feet or so, give or take a little, to have met within just a few feet. And here's the other thing, that there is only a 12-inch drop from one end to the other, from the Gihon Springs end, dropping then 12 inches to the Siloam Pool, which allows for the perfect flow of water sufficiently from the springs down to the pool. Absolutely fascinating when you think about it. This tunnel is still there today. It remains passable. You are still able to, at least as of the last I was aware, which has not been but just a few years ago, you were still able to technically walk through it. Now, only at certain times under supervision, but it's still accessible for you to be able to make your way through this tunnel. This is not an unusual thing, and I had intended to do a whole presentation about the water systems of ancient Israel. Obviously, I won't be able to do that in this particular presentation. But every major fortified city had a means of protecting its water supply. And whether you're at Megiddo or Hatzor or any number of other places, there were either tunnels or there were walk-down areas that you would traverse deeply below the top level of the city to get to actually the pool that was the water supply from typically an external source or springs, which would have been then tunneled over from there. The external area would have been stoned over, completely camouflaged, so that there was no way that the besieging army would know where that was to be. And as a result, they would protect their water supplies. Truly, truly fascinating. So it's likely during this time, and probably immediately preceding the Assyrian siege, that the events of Hezekiah's illness took place. And that's why I said earlier that there appears to be a little bit of a disconnection with the chronology in terms of the flow of the chapters. But this is not to worry about. But it does give us some indication in the text that this took place before the siege, because the Lord then said that he would deliver, in fact, the city and deliver Hezekiah. So the events of Hezekiah's illness take place now. Then you have Sennacherib, who comes in, conquers the king of Tyre. He marches into Judah, captures more than 40 fortified cities. The Assyrian texts actually say that it was 46 cities. And it was at Lachish, which he was assaulting and conquering at that time, that Sennacherib sent his envoy, which from there we're told that there was an army that accompanied the envoy. And so it is probable at this point that Hezekiah then sent the tribute. But Sennacherib wasn't satisfied, and with the envoy either now being sent or having already been sent to Jerusalem, Assyrian records indicate that Sennacherib considered Hezekiah to be shut in like a bird in a cage. This is one of the very famous sayings from the Old Testament kind of archaeological finds, the Assyrian records and so forth. So you have the assertion by the Assyrians in their records and their annals that in fact Sennacherib had them shut up, shut in. There was nothing that they could do about it, which is intriguing because in a moment, as we'll see, the Lord actually delivers Jerusalem and Hezekiah, and it appears that what Sennacherib claimed about Jerusalem may have been his reality, but certainly was not the Lord's intent. So it's at this point that then you have these specific events of Isaiah and 2 Kings take place. Hezekiah sought the counsel of Isaiah. The word came through Isaiah indicating deliverance. The Assyrian army suffered severe consequences at the hand of the Lord, approximately 185,000. It is speculated that he then withdrew from this area at this time. And there may be a correlation with another battle that might have been confused with what actually occurred here, where significant numbers of the Assyrian army suffered as a result of disease and such, and he withdrew from this area. Assyrian reliefs in Nineveh. One of the things that the capital was actually moved, we need to recognize this, the capital was moved back to Nineveh. And so Sennacherib then withdrew from the area, went back to Nineveh, and the reliefs that are shown there, these have been found. You can see them. There are pictures online where you can see them. Show the conquering of Lachish, but do not show, ironically, the same of Jerusalem. Now, this is important, significant, because Jerusalem was the much more important city. It was like the capital of that area. Why then would the King Sennacherib, not shown the conquering of the most important city? Well, it's likely because he did not conquer it. He withdrew from that area before. But what he did show was Lachish. And that depiction there, that relief, the carving into the rock is really, really quite important. And I do encourage you to just simply look it up. Type in the Assyrian reliefs of Nineveh, conqueror of Lachish, and you will see that is very clear what is being depicted there. So the last point in the timeline, let's say this. This brings us to an end in terms of the Assyrian assault of Jerusalem. The Lord has delivered Jerusalem. Hezekiah has been delivered. Hezekiah has also been given an extension of 15 more years, which takes us down to 686 or so. And if you think about 701 minus 15, that puts you right at 686. So this is just right in line, the biblical testimony, with what we can see about the reference points of the chronology. And then we come to the very last part here that we find in Isaiah 39 and also in 2 Kings 20. And the last part of the timeline is the visit by the envoys of Merodach-Baladan, who is, again, from Babylon. He's popped up once again. He is thrusting himself into the historical record. And the reality here, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's not just a well-wish card kind of thing, a Hallmark card that you send someone, hope you get better. It's probably more like I'm coming to, in essence, see if we can't establish some type of alliance or at least relationship that could form then an alliance. And this is where foolishly Hezekiah actually then just spills the beans, puts out all the display of the treasury, and then the prophecy occurs where Isaiah says, you have not done right with this, and in fact, these very things that you're so proud of will one day be taken away by the very nation for whom Merodach-Baladan and these envoys represent. Very, very significant ending to that. Let me conclude by just making about 3 comments about chapters 36 through 39. These chapters give us a significant amount of information, historically, narrative, from a narrative point of view, the prophecies of Isaiah. And there are 3 things. I just want to distill this into 3 primary things. First of all, they set a historical reference point for Isaiah's ministry. And anytime that we can find historical reference points for these prophets, it's a really good thing, because sometimes in prophecy, we don't have reference points. Occasionally we will have an indication like such and such earthquake happened, and that gives us a reference point. Well, here we have a reference point, and it's related to Hezekiah. It's related to Sennacherib. We have the reliefs, the Sennacherib, the Assyrian annals. So we have a really strong reference point, and that's very, very important. Second, these chapters validate his prophetic ministry in terms of the historical and archaeological correlation. So what we see here is that he prophesies and it happens. And the historical and the archaeological correlations of these events and things are, in fact, in evidence. And through interpretation, maybe of some of them, like the relief of Lachish compared to not having a relief of Jerusalem, maybe that's more interpretive, but it still gives us a historical fixed point that correlates to the prophetic ministry and to the validity of the very things that Isaiah is actually saying. And third, and this is very important as we begin moving into chapters 40 and following, thematically, the chapters prepare us for the bridge to the themes of comfort, restoration, and future hope. And I think that it's likely that this last portion, and especially the prophecy that is given by Isaiah concerning the future plunder by Babylon, the future deportation into Babylon, really helps us understand that when Isaiah, and again, remember, we're affirming the essential unity of Isaiah, when Isaiah begins prophesying about future events and future cataclysm, and then what is beyond that, he's going to prophesy comfort. These things are coming. He's said it in these chapters, but now he is going to turn his attention to the future. And I think that's in part because at this point, Isaiah is tied into this historical framework of what's happening right now. But Isaiah has the portent of what is going to happen in the future. And what he now is wanting to do as well is to reassure Israel that there is a future beyond the future that seems to be calamity. There will be restoration. So these are in some ways more like a bridge chapter that puts us in a state of preparedness for what we're going to find in chapters 40 and following. Well, I don't know about you, but this kind of material just really, really excites me, and I was so thrilled to begin thinking about this a couple of weeks ago, and fortunately now I've had the time to really sink in, dig in, and to prepare this for you. But I was just thrilled to really put this historical perspective together for you, because some of my primary interest, of course, I'm very interested in languages, especially Hebrew and the cognate languages, the other Semitic languages. I'm also interested in history tremendously, and this is a historical rooting point that I thought was of great value. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing the presentation as much as I have enjoyed giving the presentation, and I look forward to seeing you back on the next video. I'll post a video again. My hope is about one a week, and hopefully that will keep you going. We'll talk soon. Thanks.